After World War II is over, things are going to change in the world. The balance of power will have shifted. Europe being involved in this grand war, and really everywhere in the world being involved in this war, has left two powers really at the forefront of everything, and that's going to be the United States and the USSR. And they have very different ideas of what the world should look like afterwards. And that's going to lead us into this era called the Cold War. So during the Cold War, basically, as I said, the USSR and the United States are the superpowers. Now, why are they the superpowers? Well, the USSR is actually going to struggle economically more than the United States, but in terms of resources, it has more resources that were left untouched. The United States did not really do any fighting in its own territory, so also their resources are untouched. This is a quote from the State Department at the time. It says, "The reins of world leadership are fast slipping from Britain's competent but now very weak hands. These reins will be picked up by either the United States or by Russia," meaning that Britain had really been controlling the world, right? They had the sun never sets on the British Empire. But World War II has left them completely weak, and they're not going to be able to maintain all of the shifting and political alliances that were happening. The United States, when we look at the United States, what they thought of the Cold War, their whole purpose was to stop the spread of communism. Basically, they thought that if communism started in one country, then the country next to it would also become communist, and so on. They called this the domino effect, right? Because if one domino falls, then they all fall. And they didn't want communism to come to the United States. Now, the USSR, they looked at this Cold War, they were using it as they were afraid of being attacked. This is not an unwarranted fear. Napoleon had attacked them, and Hitler had attacked them. So, in the past 150 years of their history, they had been attacked twice. They had a definite, real fear of it happening again. Now, why are the US and the Soviet Union so opposed to one another? Well, it has to do with their economic and political systems. The United States is a democracy with a capitalist economy. All right, that's really important because this idea of democracy and capitalism, they kind of are intertwined. The Soviet Union, they're a communist dictatorship and they have a government led command economy. What that means is the government dictates the prices, they dictate what is sold, what is made, how much it costs, and who can buy it. Totally different from the United States. Now, what's going to happen during the Cold War is these ideas of what is communism and what is democracy, they get often blurred. And we have talked about that before in that you have this idea of communism on one side, democracy on the other side, and somewhere in the middle is socialism. Well, during the Cold War, the United States took the stance that there was no middle ground. Either it was a democracy or you were communist. Anything in between was communist. Now, the USSR is also still, they carry on a lot of mistrust for the United States. One of the reasons for that is because during the Soviet or the Russian Civil War, the United States supported the White Army. They were the ones who kind of wanted to return it back to either a democracy or the czarship. But the White Army didn't really know. Remember, we talked about this, how they didn't really know what they wanted, but they knew they didn't want the communists. The United States sent troops to Russia to help the White Army. And the communists did not forget that. And then the United States, to really sort of make sure the USSR knows that they don't like them, they didn't even recognize them as a country until 1933. They still would call it Russia, not USSR. They only recognized them in 1933 because they had a common enemy. And that was, during World War II. Then, during World War II, the United States and Britain were actually really slow to start looking at helping the Russians out on the Eastern Front. They were all about putting in, their efforts on the Western Front. And so the USSR felt like, oh, well, you want the Germans to conquer us. We see how you are. Then, at the end of the war, when Harry Truman knew about the atomic bomb and knew he was going to use it on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he didn't tell the Russians. He didn't tell Stalin, even though Stalin totally knew about it because he had spies that were helping build this thing. They wouldn't tell him because they wanted to keep that power to themselves. Also, after when World War II was coming to an end, during World War II, the United States had a policy called Lend Lease. And the United States said, we will lend you money, we will lease you airplanes, we will lease you equipment to fight your enemies. They totally gave tons of support to France, to England, but they would not. They were doing it to USSR during the middle of the war, but once they realized that Germany was going to lose, they cut off their supplies to the USSR. The US was thinking, well, we don't want to arm these people that could possibly be our enemies after the war. Then the United States was willing to give aid to Europe to help rebuild, right? So they gave everybody else loans, except they did not give any to the USSR. They gave 3.7 billion to Britain, did not give any to the USSR. Then that brings us to how Germany is divided. So when the war ends, this is the big three. You have Winston Churchill representing Britain, Franklin Roosevelt representing the United States, and Stalin representing the USSR. Now, of course, Roosevelt's going to pass away, and that'll leave Harry Truman in charge at the end of the war. But this is the Yalta Conference, and happens in 1945. Roosevelt's still alive. During this conference, Stalin says, because the other two powers go, hey, as you've been going through Europe, what about all these countries that you're liberating, you're freeing from the Germans? Right now, you still have your army there. Are you planning on pulling your armies out once the war is over? And Stalin says, hey, when this is done, those countries can have free elections. They will, of course, want communism. Who wouldn't? But I'm willing to let them have free elections. But then he later on says this: for the Russian people, the question of Poland is not only a question of honor, but also a question of security. Throughout history, Poland has been a corridor through which the enemy has passed into Russia. Poland is a question of life and death for Russia. So Poland, one of these Eastern European countries that he had said can have free elections at the Yalta Conference in 1945, then he turns around and says, there's no way that's going to happen because anybody who's ever tried to get to us has tried to get to us through Poland. We will not allow that to happen again. So Stalin, even though he says, yeah, don't worry, Roosevelt, don't worry, Churchill, I'm totally going to let these people have free elections, he really doesn't have any intention of letting that happen. Stalin actually was thinking all of these Eastern European countries would basically buffer the Soviet Union from Western Europe and keep them safe in case of attack and or the dissemination of ideas. He says whoever occupies a territory also imposes his own social system. Everyone imposes his own system as far as his armies can reach. It cannot be otherwise. So he didn't even think of the idea that he basically thought that no matter who controlled these countries, they're going to put their own social ideas on them. And that's what's going to happen. So he would rather it be him, his will, his ideas than the US and Western Europe. So after the war is over, they basically look at Germany and divide it into fourths. So you have part of it is going to be controlled by Russia. part is going to be controlled by England. France has a small section here, and then the United States has this area over in the east. Now, the section here that was controlled by France, that's what borders France, right? The section up here, more northern, it's closer to seaports. That's why it's covered by Britain. This area right here, that's where Russia, their troops were marching into. Now, this area right in the middle, that's Berlin. Berlin was the capital of Germany. So what they do with Berlin is they divide the city of Berlin also into 4 sections. Okay, so each one of these countries is in charge of this area. Now, the whole thing, they're in charge of this area because they're supposed to basically, hey, Germany, we just defeated you. You have no leadership because we took the leadership you had, they're gone, right? We can't trust them to lead you because the last time they led you into war. So the idea was that each one of these countries would basically protect the citizens from any looting or crime, try to help rebuild, like kind of give them, hey, a boost up to add security and stability, but eventually to leave Germany and let Germany do its own thing. So the US wants Germany totally reunited, but the USSR says, oh, heck to the no, because Germany cost us how many 20 million lives? We are not stepping out of Germany until they've paid us back. This is what basically it causes the world, Germany gets divided. So this line here that is Eastern Germany, they basically close this area off, right? So this area, it's all controlled by the Soviet Union. They're not going to let anybody in or out. Berlin's the capital, right? It's right in the middle. So what happens is the Soviet Union tries to keep everybody out of Berlin. It tries to basically keep Berlin as its own part of East Germany. Nobody can get her in or out. But the US, France, and Britain, they basically controlled these parts of Berlin. And they were like, oh, no, 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 no. So think about, this is a city that is divided. One day, the USSR starts putting up a fence. They start putting up a giant wall and blocking off. And basically, they were keeping people from leaving. At first they wouldn't let them leave Berlin at all. They couldn't leave the city at all. It was totally just blocked off. And so the U.S. said, okay, this isn't going to work. That's not cool. They were hoping, of course, that because these people would have no supplies, that they would have to sort of become part of the Eastern Berlin. But the U.S. under Harry Truman was like, oh, no, no, no. West Berlin is free. West Berlin is a part of West Germany. You can't do that. So they basically had airlifts for a full year. Airplanes would leave England. They would fly over East Germany, drop supplies with parachutes into West Germany or at West Berlin, and then fly back. And they were doing that on 24-hour rotations, right? So this was happening every single day. Every 12 hours, there would be a flight with supplies because that was the only way they were getting food. That was the only way they were getting messages. That was it. That was their only way of being in touch with Western society because the Soviet Union had completely blocked them off. During this time, this is a very tense time because at any point, the Soviet Union, if they had shot down one of those planes, that would have been a reason for a war. And that would have been another world war. So this is a big deal. The Berlin airlift is a huge deal. And it also, because they come out of it, Berlin comes out of it, and the Soviet Union has to sort of say, okay, fine, Berlin, we'll let you get supplies the normal way. But because of that, they built a huge wall, and that becomes the Berlin Wall. What happens to Berlin happens to Germany. What happens to Germany happens to Europe. And that was the fear. If Berlin had fallen, then all of Germany would become communist, and eventually